They were given 48 cities. Now, 6 of those cities the Levites had were called the cities of refuge. And what was the purpose of those cities? Numbers 35 and verse 11 says, "You should choose cities convenient for yourselves to serve as cities of refuge where the manslayer who unintentionally kills someone should flee. These cities will serve as a refuge for you from the blood avenger, so that the manslayer will not die until he stands trial before the assembly." The 6 cities of refuge that you provide will serve this purpose. And so there were to be 3 cities on the east side of Jordan and 3 cities on the west side of the Jordan. And so these were cities where someone who unintentionally killed someone could flee before the avenger of blood could take vengeance on them. And then they would stand trial and find out if it was truly unintentional. But in verse 16 it says, "But if he struck him with an iron instrument and he dies, he is a murderer. The murderer should be put to death without fail." Verse 17 of same chapter 35, "And if he struck him with a stone that could cause death and he dies, he is a murderer. The murderer should be put to death without fail. And if he struck him with a wooden instrument that could cause death and he dies, he is a murderer. The murderer should be put to death without fail." It says, verse 19 says, "The avenger of blood is the one who will put the murderer to death. When he encounters him, he himself will put him to death." So here we see the things that would be evident. They would find out, because a person may flee to the city of refuge, and then when they find out that he used such instruments, then that person would be convicted of murder, and the avenger of blood will be able to put them to death. So you think about it today with all these guns and everything, and people using these weaponry against one another. How would they fare in these cities of refuge? They'd be convicted as murderers and be put to death swiftly. No, they wouldn't be trying to force a confession out of somebody. They would do as Deuteronomy 13:14, so investigate thoroughly. And so they would find out what happened. There wouldn't be no side, the prosecutor's side and the defense side. No, they'd be just simply trying to find out what happened. And once they found out that it fell into any of these categories here, the person would be guilty of murder. And so today with the weapons, and they found out that you used the weapon, then you would definitely be convicted as a murderer, and you'd be put to death swiftly. Notice verse 20 says, "If death resulted because he pushed him out of hatred, or threw something at him with malicious intent, or out of hatred he struck him with his hand and he died, and the one who struck him will be put to death without fail. He is a murderer. The avenger of blood will put the murderer to death when he encounters him." So here we see another aspect, that if he might have ran to the city of refuge, but if finally he had hatred for the person, and he pushed him, and he did all these things, and he died, then they would put him to death. Even though he may not have intended for him to die, but he struck him and he had that hatred for him, then he would be a murderer and be put to death. He would be handed over to the avenger of blood. So how would the racists fare under those circumstances? They wouldn't make it. They might have ran to the city after they did what they did and tried to get some refuge. Like today, they try to get the courts to find some reason to excuse them of their evil, even though they had this hatred for a person just because of their skin color. As the Proverbs says, do not quarrel with a man when he's not done anything to you. So here they're quarreling with people who have not done anything to them simply because of their race. And so if Twitter or these social media accounts were back then, when these cities of refuge were there, they'd been able to check your social media accounts and all this hatred that you spewed out, and you'd be declared a murderer. because of your hatred for that person. You may not even know the person, but if you, because of their skin color or whatever, you had hatred for them for whatever reason, and you killed them, you might claim it was an accident, you'll be declared a murderer. See, we can see a racist would not make it. I mean, he might have ran to the city of refuge, but once they found out that hatred, they turn you over to the Avenger of Blood to be executed. So this is why we read in 1 John chapter 3, it says, verse 15, says, everyone who hates his brother is a murderer, and you know that no murderer has everlasting life remaining in him. If you got that hatred for your own brother, for your fellow man, for your neighbor, you have no everlasting life. So when people talk about, oh, I'm a Christian, and then they're going to be a racist, ain't happening in God's arrangement. You're a murderer. And God, you will be put to death. You are liable to be put to death by the Avenger of Blood, which will be Jesus Christ, when he returns to judge those for life and death. If you unintentionally did something, like under the law of the cities of refuge, and the trial showed that it was accidental, then what would happen? If it was accidental, verse 22 said, but if it was unexpectedly and not out of hatred, and he pushed him or threw away an article at him without malicious intent, or if he did not see him and caused a stone to fall on him, and he was not an enemy or seeking his injury, and the person died, the assembly should then judge between the one who struck him and the Avenger of Blood in harmony with these judgments. The assembly should save the manslayer from the hand of the Avenger of Blood and return him to his city of refuge, to which he had fled, and he must dwell in it until the death of the high priest, who was anointed with the holy oil. It says, but if the manslayer goes out of the boundary of his city of refuge to which he fled, and the Avenger of Blood finds him outside the boundary of his city of refuge and slays the manslayer, he has no blood guilty. See, because he must dwell in the city of refuge until the high priest dies. So even though it was unintentional, you still had to stay in that city of refuge. You could not go out of it until the high priest died, however long that took. So even though it was unintentional. So there was mercy shown, but you had to act according to the rules to receive that mercy. So today, if we're not going to be considered a murderer, as the Apostle John wrote about in 1 John 3, then we have to get the hate out the heart. We can't have hate for our brothers, for our neighbors, even for our enemies. So we must learn to love and to forgive and have mercy. And that many times that's a hard lesson to learn. That's why we have to take refuge in Jesus, in God and Jesus, God and Jesus. They are our city of refuge, and learn these qualities. 1 John 4:8 says, whoever does not love has not come to know God, because God is love. In verse 20, if anyone says, I love God, and yet is hating his brother, he is a liar. For the one who does not love his brother, whom he has seen, cannot love God, whom he has not seen. And it says, and we have this commandment from him, that whoever loves God must also love his brother. So therefore, if we don't want to be deemed a murderer, we got to get the hate out the heart, and we got to learn the ways of love, to love our brother, which involves forgiveness, which involves mercy, having that love towards our brother, wanting to do good towards them, trying to be helpful to them. But if we carry around hate and grudge, see, we can't find refuge in Jesus, because we're not in union with him, because we don't have this love. So it's important that we be in what we can call the University of Jesus. Jesus being the professor, teaching love to us, teaching us the ways of God, teaching us what love means. And that has to be something we must always do to keep learning, because it's a hard lesson. I mean, you're in that class that Jesus teaches. The tendency is to go to the back of the class because you don't want to be in the front. But you want to be in that class. It's a very difficult lesson to learn for all of us, but it's something that we have to learn to get the hate out and bring the love in. And again, we have to understand, first of all, what love is. We know God is love. He sets the standard. He taught Jesus. Jesus teaches us. So we have to learn from Jesus, the master, how to love, what love means, what it's about, and how to cultivate it, things we can do to build that love up. So, because we don't want to be deemed a murderer, which we will be deemed a murderer if we continue with hatred. But we get the hatred out, bring the love in. Now Jesus and his Father is a true city of refuge for us, and we'll be able to continue to live and enjoy the mercy. So love is the key. Love is the answer. Not the love of the world, but the love of God. And so if we're in the class, if we're being humbled to learn from Jesus, being in the University of Jesus, I call it, letting the professor Jesus teach us about this love, learn what this love is about, what does it mean, and then striving to work to cultivate it, which is not going to be easy, but it's something we got to do.